When I saw my husband standing by the bathroom door, looking through the crack as water dripped endlessly from the broken faucet, my heart clenched, not from fear of being caught, but from the knowledge of what that moment might mean. He wasn't looking at me, not really, his gaze lingered on the scene inside, and in his silence I heard the weight of questions he would never ask. I froze, towel clutched in my hand, my mind racing through everything that had led us here, every glance, every word, every tiny choice that had seemed harmless until it wasn't. That single drop of water from the faucet seemed to echo through the house, louder than footsteps, louder than breath, as if it were counting down to something inevitable. His hands stayed in his pockets, and he didn't say a word, and that, more than shouting, terrified me. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake. A mistake that would stretch its shadow across every room in this house. A mistake that would turn silence into something sharp and unbearable. Before I tell you what happened, and why I let it happen, let me take you back to the day everything shifted, even if I didn't realize it at the time. The day he came back began like any other, though in hindsight I can see how the air felt heavier even before I heard the car in the driveway. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where every holiday and every argument had been staged for decades, when I saw the unfamiliar shadow cross the window. My breath caught, not because I didn't know who it was, but because I did. It had been years since he had been here. Years in which he had gone away to build his own life, and we had stayed behind in this quiet house, my husband and I, carrying on with our rituals, the same breakfast routine, the same evening news humming in the background, the same words exchanged about the weather. When the door opened and he stepped inside, it felt like a door inside me opened too, though I wouldn't have admitted it then. My husband stood up from his chair, smiling in that restrained, polite way he reserves even for people he loves. "You made it," he said, voice steady, as if this visit were just another obligation checked off a list. But I saw the tightness in his jaw, the way his fingers flexed once at his side before he put a hand on his son's shoulder. I stayed seated longer than I should have, watching the man who crossed the threshold. He wasn't the boy who had left. There was a weight to his posture now, a calm confidence, the kind you get only after facing the world and coming back changed. He set down his bag, his eyes scanning the room like he was both familiar with it and a stranger in it. And when his gaze met mine, there was no polite avoidance, no quick glance away, it stayed, steady and searching, as if he were reading something on my face I hadn't realized was written there. Dinner that night should have been unremarkable. I had cooked too much, as always, laying out more dishes than 3 people could eat, because cooking is how I fill the spaces words can't. We sat around the table, my husband asking about his work, about his plans, about things that could fill the silence. But my focus wasn't on the answers. It was on the way his hand brushed crumbs off the table, the way he leaned back in his chair, the way his smile, rare, but easy, made me realize how long it had been since I'd seen one like it in this house. There was no inappropriate word spoken that evening, no gesture that would have alarmed anyone looking in. And yet something had shifted. Not loudly, not even noticeably, but like the faintest tilt of the ground beneath your feet, enough that, if you're still, you feel yourself sway. Later, as I cleared the plates, I caught him watching me from the hallway. He didn't look away quickly, didn't cover it with small talk or excuse himself. He just watched, and for the briefest second, I didn't mind. When I finally sat down that night, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator, I thought of my husband, sitting in his chair with his paper like always. And I thought of the other man in the guest room, his son, unpacking his bag, setting his things in the room that used to smell like dust and absence. I didn't know what to call the feeling in my chest then. It wasn't excitement, not exactly. It wasn't guilt either, not yet. But something had been stirred. Something I had kept buried for so long, under layers of laundry, grocery lists, and polite dinners. I told myself it was just the strangeness of having someone new in the house again, of breaking the quiet routine we'd settled into. I told myself it was just nostalgia for the days when the house was full, for the days when someone's laughter could fill the hallways. But that night, lying in bed next to my husband, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't ignore that the house felt different. Not because of what anyone had said or done, but because, for the first time in a long time, I felt different. The morning after his return began with the sound of dripping, not from the rain, but from the bathroom. That slow, insistent tap of water against porcelain felt louder than the clock on the kitchen wall, louder than the muted news on the television my husband always watched over breakfast. I stood at the sink, rinsing a mug, and stared at the ceiling as if that could quiet the sound. It didn't. By the time my husband left for work, promising to call someone about that faucet later, I already knew he wouldn't. He rarely did. Little things in the house had been breaking for years, a hinge, a drawer, the squeak of the front door, and most stayed broken, waiting for attention that never came. That morning, though, the faucet wasn't just an annoyance. It was an excuse, though I wouldn't have admitted that to myself then. I found him, my stepson, in the living room, sitting on the couch with a book in his lap. He looked up, casual, like he had been there for hours or seconds, impossible to tell. I mentioned the faucet almost without thinking, as if the words slipped out of their own accord. "The bathroom faucet's dripping again," I said. "Your father keeps saying he'll fix it, but..." He stood up without hesitation. "I can take a look." I should have told him it wasn't necessary, that I'd wait for a plumber, that it could wait. But instead, I said nothing. Instead, I watched him grab a small tool bag from the corner of the room, one I hadn't noticed he had brought in the night before. The bathroom suddenly felt smaller when he stepped inside. I hovered in the doorway, not close enough to be in the way, not far enough to leave him alone. The tiles under my feet were cold. The sound of water dripping into the sink was louder here, more insistent. He bent over the faucet, sleeves pushed up, fingers working at the handle with an easy confidence. I watched the way he studied the mechanism, the calm way he worked. There was no rush in his movements, but no hesitation either. He turned a knob, loosened a screw, and the drip slowed for a moment, then started again. "It's old," he said, his voice matter of fact, without judgment. "Might need a new washer." I nodded, even though I wasn't sure what that meant. My hand rested on the doorframe, and for a second, I realized how close we were, not touching, but close enough that I could feel the warmth of him even with space between us. He glanced back at me, smiling slightly. "Don't worry. I'll get it working." The smile was small, but it stayed with me. The drip stopped for a heartbeat when he tightened something, then started again. He frowned, concentrated. I moved closer without meaning to, standing just inside the bathroom now, the hem of my sweater brushing against the counter. He smelled faintly of soap and something metallic from the tools. And then it happened, not planned, not even thought through. It was sudden, almost accidental, like a step taken on uneven ground. We were standing too close, his hand brushed mine as he adjusted the faucet, and the space between us collapsed. We kissed. It wasn't long. It wasn't deliberate. But it happened. I pulled back first, breath sharp, as if the walls of the bathroom had closed in. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. The dripping faucet was suddenly deafening again, like it had been waiting for the silence to return. He wiped his hands on a towel, cleared his throat, and said, "I'll have to get that washer." And then he left the bathroom, leaving the tools neatly stacked by the sink. I stayed behind, staring at the faucet. The water dripped again, each drop marking time, as if it were asking me if I understood what had just happened. I told myself it didn't mean anything. That it was a moment born of proximity, of routine disruption, of nostalgia for when the house had been full and warm. I told myself it could be ignored, smoothed over, erased by the next day. But when I stepped into the hallway and saw his bag by the stairs, his jacket draped over the chair, I knew there was no undoing it. I stood there, towel still in my hand, the faintest taste of the kiss lingering like something I wasn't supposed to admit I'd noticed. The faucet kept dripping. And for the first time, I didn't care if it was ever fixed. That evening, after the moment in the bathroom, the house felt as if it had been rearranged, though nothing had physically moved. I could still trace every familiar detail, the framed pictures, the worn carpet at the base of the stairs, the chipped corner of the kitchen counter, but somehow the spaces between them had changed. I kept replaying the day in my head, wondering how something so brief could shift the weight of everything around it. At dinner, I set the table as always. My husband sat in his usual place, reading the newspaper while waiting for the food to cool. The news anchor's voice murmured from the TV in the next room. All of it should have felt normal, should have grounded me, but I was hyper-aware of him, of the man who had arrived only yesterday, sitting across the table, calm and easy as if he'd never been gone. The evening was quiet, the conversation mostly small things, weather, work, the news. My husband asked questions about his son's life, where he was staying before coming here, how long he planned to visit. The answers were polite, measured, but it wasn't the words that held me. It was the pauses, the moments when our eyes almost met and then didn't, the way I noticed each gesture, how he leaned back in his chair, how he rested his forearm on the table, how his fork hovered midair when he spoke. I thought of the bathroom, of the kiss that had happened like a stumble, and wondered if he was thinking about it too. He didn't look at me for long, not directly, but there was a tension there, something unspoken yet undeniable. After dinner, my husband excused himself to make a phone call. The kind of phone call that turns into half an hour, 40 minutes, sometimes longer. He stepped into his office and closed the door, leaving the two of us clearing plates in silence. I tried to focus on the dishes, but each clink of porcelain seemed too loud. My fingers trembled slightly when I handed him a plate to dry, and I hoped he didn't notice. We moved around each other in the kitchen, avoiding eye contact yet fully aware of the other's presence. The scrape of a chair on the floor startled me when my husband returned, his conversation apparently finished. He didn't look at us oddly, didn't linger on our faces, but I still felt caught, though there was nothing to catch. When he settled into his chair with his evening coffee, I found myself staring at the family photos on the wall. One in particular, a picture taken years ago, before the house fell into its slow rhythm, held my gaze. I saw him in it as a teenager, awkward smile, standing beside me in a way that back then had meant nothing more than closeness for a photograph. I saw myself, younger, hair lighter, eyes softer. The memory of that younger version of me lingered as I sat back down. I wondered when I'd started feeling invisible in my own house. It wasn't that my husband was unkind, he wasn't. He provided, he stayed, he asked after my day. But the touch that used to rest on my hand without hesitation, the warmth in his voice when we first married, those had faded so gradually that I didn't realize they were gone until now, until I noticed someone else's presence filling the space where that warmth had once been. The night wore on quietly, and eventually my husband went to bed early. He always did on weeknights, leaving me alone in the dim light of the living room. I stayed there longer than usual, pretending to watch television but not really seeing the screen. I heard footsteps on the stairs, and he appeared in the doorway, not hesitant, not bold, just there. He asked if I needed anything. The question was ordinary, but it felt heavier somehow, like it held another meaning. "No," I said. "Thank you." He nodded, his hand resting briefly on the doorframe before he turned and went upstairs. I stayed where I was, staring at the blank reflection of myself in the darkened TV screen. Later, when I finally went to bed, I slipped beneath the sheets beside my husband, who was already asleep, his breathing deep and steady. The house was quiet, but my thoughts weren't. I thought about what had happened in the bathroom, about the look on his face when he adjusted the faucet, about how close we'd been standing. I told myself I was imagining the tension, that I was overthinking. But even in the dark, with the steady sound of my husband's breath next to me, I felt that shift again, the subtle but certain shift in the air that made everything familiar feel just slightly wrong. I stared at the ceiling until my eyes ached, unable to stop asking myself the question I already knew the answer to: why did I let that kiss happen? And why, even now, couldn't I convince myself I regretted it? The following morning felt ordinary on the surface, yet everything under it was unsettled. The kitchen smelled of toast and coffee, the table was set in the way I'd done for years, and my husband read his newspaper, barely glancing up. It was the same routine I could have performed with my eyes closed, but I couldn't stop my thoughts from circling back to the night before, to the day before that. The kiss hadn't been mentioned, not even hinted at, yet it was in the air, lodged like an invisible splinter. My husband left for work earlier than usual, mumbling about meetings and errands, and the house went quiet. The kind of quiet that makes every sound exaggerated, the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock, and, faintly from upstairs, that maddening drip from the faucet. I tried to keep myself busy, but even folding laundry felt heavier, each shirt and towel reminding me of the order I'd always kept and the chaos I felt creeping in. Around mid-morning, he found me in the hallway, holding a shopping list I'd written half out of habit, half as an excuse to step outside the walls that suddenly felt too close. He glanced at the paper in my hand and asked if I needed help with errands. His tone was easy, casual, but the offer carried weight. I hesitated longer than I should have before saying yes. We drove into town together in his car. The drive wasn't long, but it felt stretched out, the landscape of familiar streets sliding past in silence broken by small bursts of conversation. We talked about practical things at first, what groceries I needed, how the weather had been colder than usual, but every pause between words felt loaded, as if both of us were aware of what we weren't saying. At one point, his hand brushed mine on the gear shift when he reached for it, a fleeting touch so small it could have meant nothing. But I felt it. Every nerve seemed to recognize it. The grocery store was busy, but inside that crowd it somehow felt more intimate than the house. I caught myself noticing the smallest things, the way he carried the basket instead of letting me take it, the way his eyes scanned the shelves and then glanced at me, as if waiting for approval for each choice. We bumped into someone I vaguely knew, a neighbor, a woman from town, and she smiled too brightly, commenting on how nice it was to see me out shopping with family. Her words were harmless, but they stung in a way I couldn't explain. I laughed it off, but the look she gave us lingered in my mind long after we left. The drive home was quieter. He rested one arm on the window, the other lightly on the steering wheel, and I stared out at the passing houses, feeling that tension coil tighter, though no one spoke of it. When we pulled into the driveway, I lingered a moment before unbuckling my seatbelt, my hand resting on the latch longer than it needed to. We unloaded the bags together, walking side by side up the front steps, and every movement felt deliberate, even if it wasn't. Inside, we unpacked the groceries in silence, each item finding its place in the cupboards we'd all used for years. It was so ordinary, but that ordinariness felt fragile, as if one wrong word could shatter it. When my husband returned later, the house seemed to slip back into its routine. He asked about the groceries, thanked him for driving me, and went about his evening as though nothing unusual had happened. But that night, when I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling again, I thought about the way his hand had brushed mine, the way we'd moved around each other in those aisles. I thought about how a simple trip into town had felt like more than an errand. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was reading into every glance and every silence. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. That evening stretched out in a way that made time feel heavy. My husband called to say he'd be working late, and his voice on the phone carried no hint of suspicion, no trace of the quiet storm brewing inside me. He was simply matter of fact, asking if I needed anything from town before he came home. I said no, almost too quickly, and hung up before the pause between us could grow uncomfortable. The house felt different when it was just the two of us again. I lit the fire in the living room, more out of habit than need. It wasn't that cold, but the glow made the room softer, shadows dancing across the walls like reminders of things unsaid. He came into the room not long after, leaning against the doorway for a moment before stepping inside. We talked at first about ordinary things. He asked about the groceries we'd bought earlier, and I told him where I'd stored them. I mentioned the neighbor we'd seen at the store, and he smiled faintly, as though he'd expected me to bring her up. The words were normal, but the pauses between them were not. As we sat near the fire, the conversation shifted. He asked about my life before I met his father, questions he'd never asked before, as if something about being here now made him curious. I answered honestly, though the honesty felt like a kind of exposure. I talked about the jobs I'd had, the places I'd lived, and, cautiously, the dreams I'd once held that now felt foreign even to me. He listened intently, nodding at the right moments, but it wasn't just listening, it was attention in a way I hadn't felt in years. It was the kind of focus that makes you feel seen, really seen, and the weight of it both comforted and unsettled me. At one point, he reached for the poker to adjust the logs in the fire, and his arm brushed against mine. It was nothing, it could have been nothing, but the spark of contact sent an uninvited awareness through me. The fire cracked softly, and there was a moment of stillness that felt too full, as if it might spill over if either of us moved. Then it happened again, inevitable this time, not accidental, not hesitant, we kissed, There was no mistaking the choice in it this time. We both drew back almost at once, the distance between us feeling heavier than before. I stared into the fire, my breath uneven, trying to pretend the kiss hadn't happened while knowing that pretending was pointless. He didn't say anything, and neither did I. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make it worse, and silence was the only thing we could agree on. When my husband finally came home, long after the fire had burned down to embers, the house looked unchanged. Dinner dishes were washed, the living room was tidy, and there was no sign of the moment that had passed like a whisper. But as I lay in bed later, staring at the ceiling yet again, I felt the weight of what couldn't be undone. The kiss no longer felt like a single slip, like something that could be buried under routine. It felt like a step forward into something I wasn't sure how to stop. The morning after that second kiss felt almost unbearably normal, and that was its own kind of weight. The routines were the same, coffee in the pot, toast on the counter, my husband skimming headlines on his phone before leaving for work. He kissed my cheek goodbye like he always did, nothing in his voice or his expression giving away any suspicion. But the way I stood in the doorway, holding the empty coffee mug in my hand a little too long, betrayed that something inside me wasn't normal anymore. After he left, the house felt too still, like it was listening. I busied myself with chores, folding laundry, sweeping the kitchen floor, wiping down the counters, even though none of it really needed doing. Each task was just a way to keep my hands moving, because the moment they stilled, my mind replayed everything from the night before in excruciating detail. By mid-morning, I heard movement outside and footsteps crossing the yard, the creak of the garden gate. When I glanced out the kitchen window, I saw my husband in the garden, bending over the flower beds. He shouldn't have been there, he'd said he was leaving early for the office, but instead he'd circled back quietly, as if checking something. I stood frozen at the sink, my breath caught somewhere between my chest and my throat. He wasn't looking toward the house at first, just at the soil, his hands moving the way they always did when he trimmed or checked something. But then his gaze shifted. He looked up, straight toward the window. His eyes lingered for a fraction too long. I stepped back instinctively, though the glass still framed me, and he could see me clearly. It wasn't the look of a man who'd caught someone doing something wrong, it was something worse. A look of someone who saw more than he'd ever say out loud. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just watched for a heartbeat more before returning to the beds, pulling up a stubborn weed as if it could distract him from what he'd noticed. The air in the kitchen thickened. I moved to the counter, opening and closing drawers I didn't need just to keep my back to the window. I could still feel his presence out there, the quiet pressure of his unspoken thoughts. Later that afternoon, he came into the house without warning. The sound of the back door startled me, sharp, sudden. He stepped into the kitchen, wiping his hands on a rag, eyes scanning the room as if he were taking inventory. He asked about lunch, about errands, about nothing in particular, but his voice felt careful. It wasn't what he said, it was what he didn't. When he left again, the silence he left behind was almost louder than his questions. That evening, the three of us were in the same room for dinner, and it was unbearable. The table felt smaller than ever. My husband asked about the faucet, casually, as though the question meant nothing. "Did you get it fixed?" he said, not looking directly at anyone. My stepson answered easily. "Not yet. I need a new part." The words were plain, but they seemed to hang in the air, heavier than they should have been. I sat there, my hands folded tightly in my lap under the table, feeling the friction between the two worlds I was straddling. The one where nothing had changed, and the one where everything had. Later, when the dishes were done and the house had quieted again, I walked past the bathroom. The faucet still dripped, a steady, patient sound. I stood in the doorway, staring at it, and felt like it was marking time, counting the seconds until something finally broke. That night, lying in bed, I heard my husband's steady breathing beside me, but my mind was back at the kitchen window. I couldn't shake the image of him standing there in the garden, looking in, not asking, not confronting, just seeing. And in some ways, that silence was harder to face than any question could have been. The evening he stayed late downstairs was the one that tipped everything over a line we'd been dancing around for days. It started quietly, like so many evenings before it. My husband left for a dinner meeting, mentioning it almost as an afterthought, and the house settled into a familiar stillness. Only this time, the stillness didn't soothe me, it made the air feel like it was holding its breath. I stayed in the kitchen for a while, tidying up dishes that didn't really need to be washed, wiping down a counter already clean. I could hear the low hum of the television from the living room, though I wasn't watching it. The faint glow of its light flickered against the walls, casting restless shadows across the floor. He was there, sitting on the couch, book in hand, though he wasn't turning the pages. His jacket was draped over the back of a chair, shoes left neatly by the door, like he had made himself quietly at home. When I passed through the room, he looked up, his expression calm, almost careful. We spoke little at first. A remark about the weather, a comment about dinner. The kind of words you can say in front of anyone. But under them was something neither of us dared to name. I poured 2 cups of tea without asking if he wanted one, placing his on the table beside him. He thanked me softly, his voice low enough that it seemed swallowed by the space between us. We sat in the living room, the fire unlit but the air still carrying that faint scent of ash from the night before. The television played quietly in the background, more noise than focus, the kind of filler sound you leave on to feel less alone. There was no grand conversation, no confession. Just moments. The way he leaned forward slightly when I spoke. The way my hand brushed the edge of his sleeve when I reached for my cup. The house felt smaller with every passing minute, as though the walls themselves were leaning in, nudging us closer. It wasn't planned. It wasn't discussed. It simply happened, as though gravity pulled us to the only outcome that felt inevitable. We spent the night together. The house seemed impossibly quiet when dawn came. The pale light seeped in through the curtains, revealing a living room that looked unchanged, the mug still on the table, the blanket draped over the arm of the couch. But nothing about the silence felt the same. When I finally stood up, my legs felt unsteady, my chest tight in a way I couldn't quite name. I straightened the cushions, picked up the mugs, and wiped the table as though cleaning could erase what had happened. It couldn't. He didn't linger that morning. There were no long glances or heavy words. He simply moved through the house, gathering his things with a kind of quietness that made me ache. I watched him leave the room, every step heavy in my ears. When my husband came home later, I couldn't meet his eyes for longer than a moment. He kissed my cheek the way he always did, and the gesture felt like a line drawn in the wrong place, dividing two versions of myself. The day passed, but it didn't move forward. It just sat there, thick and unspoken, with the weight of everything we'd done pressing against every breath. And for the first time, I couldn't even pretend I didn't know how much had changed. The morning after felt like walking through someone else's house, one that looked exactly like mine but wasn't. Every object, every corner was the same, but the weight of what had happened clung to everything. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee, just like always, but even that scent felt altered, sharper somehow, as if it carried a question I couldn't answer. My husband was quiet at breakfast. He wasn't angry, he wasn't suspicious, at least not in any obvious way. But he moved differently, like each action had been slowed down. He stirred sugar into his cup, stared at the swirl for a beat too long, then set the spoon down with a softness that somehow sounded like restraint. He didn't look at me for more than a second at a time, and that brief glance said more than any long stare ever could. I told myself it was just my guilt making me see things that weren't there. But there was something about the way he breathed out slowly before speaking, the way his hands rested flat on the table, that made me think he knew. Maybe not the details. Maybe not everything. But something. He left for work, the door clicking shut behind him with its usual quiet finality, but the silence it left behind felt louder than usual. I stood at the window, holding my mug, watching his car back out of the driveway, and for a long moment, I didn't move. The house was still, painfully so. The other he, hadn't come downstairs yet. I could hear faint movement above, footsteps crossing the floor, and each creak of the boards sent a jolt through me. When he finally came into the kitchen, it was late morning. He moved with the same quietness as my husband had, but not for the same reason. His presence was careful, deliberate, as though he understood that even the sound of a chair scraping back might shatter the fragile balance we were pretending to maintain. We didn't talk much. A few words about breakfast, about errands that might need doing. I busied myself with dishes again, even though there were barely any, and the small clatter of cups and plates filled the space between us. The hours stretched thin, and I found myself restless. I wiped the counters twice, straightened things that didn't need straightening, glanced out the window every few minutes just to have somewhere to look. And then, mid-afternoon, my husband's car pulled into the driveway. I froze. He wasn't supposed to be home yet. The front door opened, and he stepped inside, setting his keys down with that same deliberate calm. He didn't ask why I looked startled. He didn't explain why he was early. Instead, he talked about the weather, about an errand he'd had to run that had brought him back sooner than expected. I nodded, trying to keep my hands steady as I reached for the kettle, though I could feel how my fingers trembled. He stayed only briefly before leaving again, saying he had to go back to the office. But those minutes were enough. The weight of his presence filled the house like fog. After he left, the silence returned, thicker than before. Dinner that night was a study in restraint. The three of us sat around the table, every sound magnified, the scrape of a fork, the clink of a glass, the shuffle of a napkin being moved. My husband asked about the garden, about the car, about things that had nothing to do with us, but each question felt like it might turn, at any moment, into something else. I kept my answers even. Steady. When the plates were cleared and my husband retreated to his office, I stood at the sink, my hands submerged in warm water, staring at the window above it. Outside, the garden lay still, the light fading from the sky. I thought about the night before. I thought about how the house had held it, how the walls must know. And I thought about my husband's silence, the silence that wasn't just absence of words, but something heavier. Something that told me he knew enough to say nothing at all. The next day I told myself I needed an errand, a reason to leave the house, a reason to step out of the heavy stillness that had been pressing down on me. The car had been making a faint noise for weeks, a sound I'd been ignoring, but suddenly it felt urgent. I took the keys off the hook, almost relieved to have an excuse, and said quietly that I would take it to be looked at. The drive to the small auto shop on the edge of town felt longer than it should have. The roads were familiar, but every turn seemed to carry too many thoughts. The radio was on low, more to fill the silence than to listen, but it didn't help much. My mind was louder than the music. When I arrived, he was there already, of course he was. His car was parked outside, and he was leaning against the workbench inside, sleeves rolled up, a rag in his hand. He looked up as soon as I walked in, as though he'd been expecting me. I explained the noise the car was making, though my words felt thin, like I was describing something that wasn't really the point. He nodded, walked with me to the car, listened carefully as I described the sound. We stood there for a long moment, both looking at the open hood, though neither of us said what we were really thinking. Inside the shop, it smelled of oil and metal, the faint tang of gasoline, the kind of scent that clings to everything and doesn't wash away easily. The air was cooler there, but heavy in its own way. He worked on the car, his hands steady, tools clinking softly as he moved. We spoke in small bursts. A question about the car. An answer about the part he thought might need replacing. A brief comment about the weather outside. Each word felt like a placeholder, something to keep the real conversation at bay. At one point, he stopped, looked at me, not long, not insistently, but enough. "We can't undo any of it," he said, his voice quiet, almost flat. I didn't respond right away. My hands were clasped in front of me, fingers twisting together, and for a moment I couldn't seem to move them. "I know," I said finally. He nodded slightly, then turned back to the car, as if the weight of those words had to be set down somewhere. The clatter of a wrench hitting the bench broke the silence a few minutes later, sharp and sudden. He muttered something about needing another tool and moved past me to get it, close enough that I could feel the faint brush of air as he passed. The rest of the repair was quiet. He explained what he had done, what still needed to be checked, his voice calm and measured. When it was finished, I thanked him, my voice steadier than I felt. On the drive home, the road seemed longer again, the car quieter now but my thoughts louder than ever. By the time I pulled into the driveway, my husband's car was already there. He was in the garden again, crouched low, pruning something, his movements careful and deliberate. I parked, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment, watching him through the glass. He didn't look up immediately. When he did, his eyes found mine for the briefest second, then went back to the soil. That second was enough. I went inside, set the keys on the counter, and tried to shake off the feeling that every action I took, every breath, was being weighed somehow. The evening passed like so many before it, dinner, dishes, the muted hum of television, but nothing felt the same. The house was full of words that would never be said, and every silence seemed to hold them. The days after the visit to the auto shop blurred together, but not because nothing happened, because too much did, and yet none of it could be spoken aloud. The house held it all like a vessel that might crack if anyone pushed too hard. I moved through the rooms doing all the same things I'd always done, washing the same dishes, folding the same laundry, sweeping the same floor, but every movement felt heavier, as if the weight of what had happened was stitched into every task. My husband didn't ask questions. Not directly. He didn't demand explanations or raise his voice, and that absence of confrontation made the silence unbearable. When he looked at me, it wasn't the same look as before, there was knowledge in it now, quiet but certain. It wasn't suspicion anymore, it was understanding, and that was somehow worse. He started spending more time outside, in the garden, in the shed, even taking longer drives just to clear his head. He didn't say it, but I knew he was pulling away, not in anger, but in the way someone instinctively recoils from a flame that's already burned them. Inside, I found myself staring at objects I'd ignored for years. The photos on the wall, the ones that had faded a little at the edges. The mugs in the cupboard, 2 chipped, 1 missing entirely. The worn rug by the door that had seen decades of footsteps. Everything felt like proof that a life had been lived here, built piece by piece, and that I had cracked something in it. He, the other he, was quieter now too. He didn't stay in the kitchen as long. He didn't linger in the living room. He still fixed things around the house, still carried himself the same way, but there was a distance to him now. Like he knew something had shifted and couldn't go back. There were no more long conversations by the fire, no unguarded moments in the kitchen. We still spoke, of course, we had to, but the words were all surface, stripped of weight, like furniture left in a house that's already been emptied of its meaning. One afternoon, my husband stood by the window for a long time. He didn't say anything, just watched the yard in silence. His hand rested against the glass, and I wondered if he was seeing the garden or seeing through it, seeing every unspoken thing in this house. I walked past him, pausing for just a second, but he didn't look at me. That small choice not to meet my eyes felt like its own answer, more final than any sentence could have been. The night that followed was quiet, almost eerily so. The kind of quiet where every small sound, the creak of the stairs, the click of a cupboard door, the faint drip of that same faucet, felt like a confession. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling in the dark, and thought about all of it. About the marriage that had felt steady but hollow. About the moments that had led me here, each one small, almost innocent, until they weren't. About how one evening turned into another, and how easily the line blurred until it was gone completely. I thought about my husband's silence and what it meant. Not just hurt. Not just disappointment. But acceptance, too, a terrible kind of acceptance. He knew. He would never say it outright, but he knew, and he had decided that he would not tear the house apart over it. That decision left me with a truth I couldn't escape: nothing would explode. There would be no dramatic ending, no sudden shattering. But the crack was there, running through all of us, and it would never heal. The next morning, I stood at the kitchen sink, the sunlight spilling through the window, warming my hands as I rinsed a mug. My husband passed behind me, quiet as always, his presence steady, almost gentle. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. The drip from the faucet had finally stopped. But the silence that followed wasn't relief. It was just another kind of sound, and I knew I would hear it forever.